Welcome everyone. This is going to be an amazing video. I think it's going to be a fantastic one to go into. But before we get into it, I want to talk about the sponsor for this video, wildstats.gg. If you want to check out your profile, or your stats, or the stats of people on your leaderboard, then this is the website for you. It has all of your leaderboard players, and this is Europe right now. You can see that Rick's random. He's a pro player, one of the best Baron laners to ever exist. You can see what he is doing. His most played games are Fiora with an 80% win rate. He has a 65% win rate on Akshan and an 88% win rate on Camille. You can see this guy's a Baron lane. You can see the types of champions that he's playing at the highest level. He's 1,991 VP in Challenger, which is absolutely disgusting. But it's such a great place to kind of get all the information of the top level players in your region. And most importantly, the pros really use this website. Just today, I'm sure some players from the WCS Philippines League clearly went to ranked all tiers. They obviously looked at some recent data and they went to the solo lane. And they went, do you know what, guys? Do you know what I think could be really hidden OP that no one's playing? Yuumi top. What's actually hilarious to me is that according to the data, Nami is the least played Baron laner in the game, but somehow Yuumi has 50 games of Baron lane. Anyway, WCS obviously saw that and thought, you know what? They're onto something here. And they ended up playing, I'm just going to figure out, there we go. They ended up playing Yuumi top lane. Don't know if it worked, but it's a teaser for my upcoming video. I will be doing some analysis on Yuumi top and that game in general. That'll be coming relatively shortly. But wildstats.gg, if you want to check the website out, please use my link in the description below. It has loads of awesome stuff. I've talked about it before. But let's say you're not a Yuumi Baron lane abuser and instead you want to play Fiora. You can jump on, you can have a look at Fiora's win rate, which has been rising over the last couple of patches, as well as the pick rate, which has been going up as well as people start to realize how good Fiora is. You can see her items, Trinity Force, Starrick's Gate, Guardian Angel, Death's Dance, Blade of the Ruined King, all of these items that are popular, as well as the popular item builds for the top players and the rune builds for the top players in the respective region that you're looking at as well. So it's just a fantastic website for all of your needs for Wild Rift. But without further ado, let's jump into our podcast with Endstep and Stuart. Welcome everyone to the unnamed Wild Rift podcast. My name's Excoundrel, joined by Stuart, of course, as usual. You guys watching on YouTube or on Stuart's stream. We have decided to up the ante this time round. Instead of me and Stu just randomly talking about matchmaking and various other topics, we have brought Endstep onto the podcast, who's going to be talking to us about various topics. He obviously covers a lot on his own stream, which, by the way, go and check out. I'll link it in my YouTube channel, and I'm sure Stu will find some way to link it in whatever he's doing. Yep. Endstep does a lot of stuff post-patch, as well as just generally being a cool dude all round. So make sure you guys go and check him out because he's a great source of information for all things Wild Rift. But for the time being, let's get into the podcast. Endstep, lovely to have you. I appreciate you taking some time out of your work morning to come and chat with us on this podcast. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I actually just got some great stuff is going on. Like yesterday, we got some great stuff approved. Not, anything super close to coming out, but some stuff that we're working on for 3.2 got greenlit, so looking really good. I'm super high up on the positives here, so I can't talk about that stuff, but I will tell you 3.1, 3.2, they're looking really good so far.
Oh, I'm excited. I am excited.
Oh. We got a while to wait for that, though.
I know.
Yeah, they're not too close, but it's. I'm really excited about him. I've been having a lot of fun doing our internal playtest. In fact, our internal playtest last night, I stole a Baron, and then I lived, so it was pretty hype.
Nice to know Baron's still in the game, I guess. Baron's still in the game.
I was the jungler, so it's way less exciting than the Baron steal I saw this morning in the game you were casting, and with the Akali. So that was like smite Baron steal, way more exciting. But
that was pretty banger.
I was pretty hyped about it because I was actually talking in the game before then about how I had never smite stolen anything in Wild Rift because I target lock so often that my smite's always like on the wrong target, and then I miss the smite.
Man.
You hate to see it.
You hate to see it. Now,
Yeah.
guys, before we get into like the meat of the podcast, for those of you who don't know Endstep, brief TLDR Endstep of who you are, what you do on Wild Rift, and kind of maybe just a little bit of how you got into game dev.
Sure. So I'll try and keep it like pretty short, and if other people want to hear about that more later, then I can talk about that somewhere else. But I'm Endstep, Riot Endstep, or Nick. All those are fine. It's kind of whatever to me. And I am a game designer that works on the systems and balance team on Wild Rift. So my team is the one that sort of owns the live environment. So we're the ones that do most of the balance changes. Well, actually, we do all the balance changes, but some things that like go in the balance section aren't necessarily always done by our team, like bug fixes and stuff like that sometimes. But we own kind of the live environment, so stuff like runes, towers, minions, like pretty much the gameplay of Wild Rift. Everything except for new champions. And new champions are passed to my team for a time before they're released, but we don't make the new champions. That's a separate team, which is appropriately called the champions team. And I've been on the team since sort of mid last year, where I moved over from. Before that, I used to be a game analyst that worked at Riot. Previously, I worked primarily on PC League, but I did also work on Wild Rift in my time as a game analyst. And sort of how I got into game dev before that, I actually used to be a software engineer working on enterprise software at big banks. And I decided I didn't like that when I got laid off at one point, and decided to sort of start just applying to things that I thought were, interesting or fun. I ended up getting getting offered the job at Riot for the game analyst position, and deciding, yeah, sure, I'll go move, across the country, because I'm actually from the East Coast, so I live in Los Angeles now. So I live like I took the 6-hour plane flight out here and just moved out to Los Angeles, and it's been about 5 years at this point, and now I am a Wild Rift game designer. So it's been kind of an interesting journey.
That's hella cool, dude. I mean, that's that is honestly a really, really cool story, and I think it's good to see people kind of follow their passions as well. Like, I quit medicine and decided to do casting for esports. That's that's another one of those very weird journeys where you just kind of. Well, no. I mean, working in the banking sector, going to games, it's quite a big step. But yeah, really cool to kind of get some info on you, and also for the guys who are watching this to kind of understand you a bit better. Let's start off with something light, something easy. Let's start off with Yuumi. That's a new addition to the Wild Rift roster. Something that I meme about Yuumi, but I actually think she's quite cool for opening up sort of different gameplay styles and sort of kind of changes that you might sort of or break away from the traditional metas, right? Like Garen Yuumi bot lane, or like we saw in SEA today, Yuumi top with Jax jungle. It's all a bit of a wild thing. What was Yuumi like for you guys on the sort of like, obviously when you have such a, or rather, let me rephrase this. When you have a champion that operates so differently compared to like a lot of other champions in the game, what's that like for you guys on the systems and balance team? Like, how do you approach having a champion that doesn't operate in a traditional manner, and how does that influence how you think about what changes that you need to make in the game?
So it does depend a lot on the champion, right? Like something like Yuumi is pretty fundamentally different from like Graves, for example, who's like actually also, strategically like pretty different from other junglers, where he's like this ranged, he has these weird auto attacks, he knocks back the camps, it's like, and obviously the degree of like how different they are is pretty different, but like just as one example of like, hey, this champion is pretty different from the others as like a sustained ranged physical damage dealer in the jungle. Yuumi is obviously different on a whole different level, right? And from our perspective on the systems and balance thing, one thing that makes this a lot easier for us to deal with is we kind of have all the knowledge from PC. And it's like, in my case, I actually worked on the game analysis team when Yuumi was released in PC, right? I have a lot of extra information and a lot of extra context that wouldn't be available to, a game where this champion had never existed in any other similar game, or someone who, didn't have all the extra context and understanding from, this time, like this time when the champion was released, in a different, obviously different but similar game. So for me personally, one of the things that I can tell you, I did, when the champion got passed to me, one of the first things I did as the balance designer that worked on Yuumi was all right, let's get in there and let's make sure all the mechanics line up with what we'd expect. And that pretty quickly revealed very early on that actually there was some miscommunication amongst the champions team, and some of the mechanics that we wanted to have on the champion long term, like the percent mana cost on Zoomies, were actually not present, which is something that I basically immediately put in a request to get that rectified, with the champ designers, to have them put that in, because the scripts are, with these new champions, if we don't want to do mechanics changes as a balance designer, we typically need to go through the champs changes, or the champs team, I mean. So one of the things I did first was like, okay, look, we want this percent mana cost. Like, I assure you, we want this. And their response was not like, oh, we thought we could get away without it. It was like more just, their response was like, oh, our bad, we should have had that in there in the first place. And it's just kind of a miscommunication issue that they've already solved, with some of their internal discussions about how they run through different champion starts. Anyway, as far as that goes, like, if let's suppose Yuumi had never existed in PC, one of the the way I would sort of approach it is kind of looking at what should this champion's strengths be and what should their weaknesses be, more so in the context of like their unique nature, right? Like with Yuumi, again, if I didn't have the experience from PC, what I'd be looking at is like, okay, so this is a enchanter that can't really be meaningfully targeted first, has a lot of freedom of target selection, both in terms of her offensive and defensive abilities, has a lot of these like really powerful strengths. What are the weaknesses that she's giving up to make up for this? Does this mean that she has a really weak laning phase, or does this mean that she doesn't scale well? Does this mean that she has some other really noticeable weakness where, one of the things we tested in PC, for example, which I know I said I was going to get away from PC examples, but just this is a good example of one of the things that we tested at one point, was like she actually had enough HP late in the game that she'd actually die to like 1 or 2 auto attacks at one point. And that was like one of the weaknesses we tried. And it's like, if I didn't know about Yuumi in PC and I wasn't part of the development process, we might have tried that in Wild Rift, where it's like, hey, what happens if this champion just has like 100 health? Like, is that okay? I mean, we might have tried that, right? And it's like, to make her have some relevant, meaningful weakness, because the truth here is that champions are supposed to have, strengths and weaknesses, just like every other element of the game is like, everything's about trade-offs. That's what makes the game interesting. And if things don't have, relevant enough strengths, that means that they're, not that interesting. And if things don't have relevant enough weaknesses, that just means they're really generic, or, they're not that interesting, right? And so that's kind of where we would start.
I think I don't know, I mean, you've seen me play Garen Yuumi before. I mean, that's I think Excoundrel has mentioned it as well. I think like Garen Yuumi is an interesting thing. I mean, in your I guess like in your opinion, I mean, Yuumi's been out for what, like 2 weeks now or something like that? Would you say that like you and like the team have done a decent job with Yuumi? Do you think like Yuumi's in a pretty decent spot now? What's your opinions on the champion since like her release and everything?
So without getting into the details of like what are we planning on doing, I can say our perspective is generally that Yuumi is underpowered. Like that we shipped her in a state where, so combination of factors, like in addition to the part where we needed to adjust some of the mechanics internally before, like at the beginning of the balance process, I did not have a lot of time to balance her, and I kind of like undershot the power level here. And one of the big differences, and this is really interesting, one of the big differences we noticed in between our testing and like what happened on the live environment, because it turns out we have a lot more stats even than I realized, because another designer actually showed me this. We were actually able to look at like how frequently is Yuumi casting Prowling Projectile, and how frequently does it hit, and like what does it hit. Actually, there was a post I think on the Wild Rift YouTube, because I was talking with Ben about this, like Draggles about this, about like in the first few days of Yuumi, when we were looking at the data, only 57% of her Prowling Projectile casts hit a champion, which is like crazy, right? Because internally we were seeing like more than 80% hit rate, probably. Mm-hmm. Like, we didn't actually count it, but like I can tell you from my experiences, I was hitting it quite frequently. And so we were looking at this of like, I don't remember what the casts per game early on was, and the hit rate has gone up a little bit since then. But we were looking at this as like, okay, this is one of the big differentials in between like the champion that we saw internally doing pretty well in our games and the champion that we see on live who's not actually performing that well, is like the Q's just not hitting that much. And so that was like one of the really big things. And like I'm actually really looking forward to future champions like using this data, like how frequently does a spell hit and what does it hit, and like indexing that against like internally what did we see.
Mhm.
And there's like a few different ways we can take this information of like, hey, look, the Q just isn't hitting as much as we would probably like. Is like, does this mean we just need to give players more time to get used to it? It's like, well, I think at this point it's like probably not going to get that much better, like maybe a little bit better over a long period of time, but I think realistically we're kind of seeing it like still being less than our expectations. It's like another way we could look at it is like, okay, well, we need to make it easier to hit to match up to our expectations. Is like, well, that's a larger change, right? It's like changing the speed or the size of the projectile would be a really big deal, and maybe we should do that long term if we think that that's healthier for the champion, but ultimately that's a long-term change. And then the third option, if we think this is appropriate, if we think she's underpowered, which we probably do, is more along the lines of like, okay, so should we just buff the payout for hitting it? Like, should we actually just be, increasing the power of hitting prowling projectiles? Like, that's probably more likely the direction that we're going to be going in the future. Is not guaranteed, but that's kind of what we're looking at as like, hey, look, we saw this champion internally, it seemed okay. We see the way she's played on live is that people often, many people don't even put points into prowling projectile until very late in the game. And even if they do, they often just don't use it that often. We'd probably want to pay off the incentive for hitting that spell and like put more power there. And it's possible that if we buff that thing too much, that she'd be overpowered, right? And at that point, it's like maybe we've sort of balanced the champion, or like put the power budget of the champion incorrectly, like into different parts of the kit. But I think generally one of the things we're pretty confident in is that prowling projectile just does not hold nearly enough power, right? I think that's something we're very confident in.
I think from my limited playtests of Yuumi, I would 100% agree with you. I'd say that prowling projectile feels fairly, yeah. It doesn't do much. Even when you do hit it, it doesn't. It feels like you're tickling your opponent.
You don't really feel the power, do you?
No.
Really, it's like you hit it and you're just like, oh, okay.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like it offers enough for bothering to try. So most of the time you just spend your time zipping between allies and using zoomies, and then trying to land a basic attack in here or there to make sure your mana doesn't get completely obliterated.
I'm actually interested, like what would be like. I wonder what the percentage is, or like how many times per game an average Yuumi player uses their passive. Because it's not. I don't think there's actually a lot of people, to be fair.
You'd have a lot of Yuumis going back.
Much, to be fair,
you'd have a lot of Yuumis going back to base all the time if they didn't use their passive. So, but nonetheless, right.
Yeah.
I guess I kind of want to make sure that we're kind of using your time wisely here. So I don't want to get into discussion about things that you would otherwise talk about on your stream. And just to be clear, everyone that's watching, if you are interested in patch changes or item changes or anything like that, Endstep usually does a really, really cool stream following a patch drop where he talks about those changes in more detail. So kind of more interested in like Endstep's thoughts on the game. So like if you were to look at the game right now, what is your biggest pain point with Wild Rift? Like not you personally, like you as a player. Obviously, I don't want to like reference this to the wider game design team in Riot, but like for you personally, what is your biggest gripe with Wild Rift right now in terms of the way it plays out or the way things interact in game?
I think from my like, so it's like different perspectives, like perspective as a game designer versus perspective as a player. Is like, I think from my personal player perspective, which is I would say pretty different from most people, seeing that I like mostly play solo. I play a lot of ranked, like trying stuff out. Like I don't tend to grind like a ton of rank trying to like actually rank up. I tend to try a lot of different stuff out and then, play TF for fun. But like from my personal perspective, I think my biggest gripe with the game is probably how quickly the early game feels like it snowballs and how quickly it feels like people give up, which isn't necessarily to say that like I think games end or like games are actually decided too early, but more so that the systems kind of convince the player that the game is over too early and enemy team gets first dragon and they're up 3 kills, like people will actually just like kind of give up a lot of the games or like, and even if they're not spamming FF, a lot of times it's just like the way that people play doesn't actually feel like they're really playing to win, or more so that people are like playing not to lose, right? Is like that's something that I find really frustrating personally. And I'm not necessarily like, I'm not trying to blame the players here of like, it's it's the players that are bad. It's like it's the systems that convince the players here. It's like the dragons are really powerful. And the truth here is like it does feel really bad to play against these like really powerful dragon buffs and a lot of the really powerful early snowballing. It's like towers do give a lot of gold, right?
Oh,
and like they do give a lot of map control, and it's like, and you can snowball really fast in the game, and you know, parts of that are necessary for the game to work, but it's possible that some of that should be set up differently, like to get more on the game design side of things, of like maybe some of this stuff should be set up a little differently so that it feels different to the players, even if it's not actually that different. It's like the feeling is like of the players is actually important, right? You know, in terms of snowballing, of like how doomed the game feels if you lose the first dragon, or how doomed the game feels if you lose, you know, 2 towers or something like that. That stuff does really matter, and so that's the kind of stuff that I personally, as a player, feel like the most bad about.
That's interesting, and I'd love to probe your thoughts a little bit further on some of those points, specifically on towers and dragons, because I think those are some cool discussion points. From your perspective, how powerful? And I'll give you my answer first as well before you go. How powerful do you think dragons really are in terms of what they offer to a team? Because my personal opinion is I don't think I've kind of talked about this with some other Riot guys before as well. I don't think players really. I don't think that the elemental system right now is landing for most players. I think most players are saying it's a dragon. I don't really care what that dragon does. And not quite so what to an extent, but most players are like, I just have to go for this dragon because it's there and it's a big icon on the screen and I should do it. You know, without really understanding the trade-offs and the benefits and the drawbacks of, like, especially in solo queue, pro play is different because they have a greater understanding. But like the trade-offs of like, is Mountain really worth my time, or is Herald much better for the way I want to play the game, right? So I'm not sure right now the current elemental system is actually landing. I think people probably have a basic understanding that Infernal good, everything else kind of mediocre, or that kind of thing. But I think that the elemental system isn't quite there. But I'd love to know, like, are dragons genuinely that impactful, and can you separate dragons being that impactful with the teams that win the dragons just being the ones that are more likely to win the game through having won the team fight around the dragon, or just, you know, other reasons that are associated with it? You know, I think that's something that I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
So I think my thought on that would be something more along the lines of like, more so like what the like problem statement I'm talking about is more about like the feeling of early snowballing involved. If not, you know, I use dragons as an example because they are like the, you know, like you're saying, is like they are the big icon. People tend to fight over, like, hey, look, the dragon is there. Let's go there and let's fight over it. You know, that kind of thing is like, I think a good for signaling purposes, but more so that the power of early snowballing is quite high in Wild Rift for sure. Like, you know, if I were making comparisons to PC League, it's like, I'm not saying it's exactly the same as like Season 3 in PC League where, you know, oh, you killed, you know, you got your solo kill in lane, the game's over type of deal. But it's very, you know, the slope is very steep in terms of how quickly you can ramp up in a game. And I think I tend to agree that the dragon buffs don't feel super different or super like they're not super appreciable, more so that like players can feel like, yep, I got the Infernal, I seem to be winning all these fights. And like, you know, when I play, I know the exact numbers of what, you know, all the dragons do. And I often still can't pinpoint, like, did that ocean, you know, make me live that fight? I don't know, right? Like, but it's powerful, right? It's like, you know, I know its power, and it's like I've looked at the data internally, and it's like I know these things are really powerful, and you know, whether it's more or less powerful than like the Herald or the towers is like less important than the fact that just like, yeah, you get these early objectives and you put a few of these together, and the game feels kind of doomed if you're against that, and if you're playing like with that, it's kind of like it feels like the game is like done, and a lot of the times is like, you know, when I go and take like, you know, I you know, recently I had a game where I was playing jungle and I took dragon, and then I crossed through mid and I killed their mid laner and I took the Herald, and I was like, game feels over. Like, you know, it actually just feels like it's over here.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and I think I'll let Stu chime in just a second as well. You know, that you answered part of my question, which is great. You kind of said that I know that elemental dragons are powerful because, you know, we know that internally, and so that's kind of cool to understand that actually they aren't just meaningless buffs, but, you know, as you mentioned as well, I don't know if it's easy for players to quantifiably associate a dragon with a specific thing that they're doing, rather than just saying, dragon good, must take dragon, I take dragon, now I win fights. And I think the issue for me is that I often, with the way that games play out, especially in solo queue, is that because dragons are just the fighty objective, and I must fighty and other team must also fighty, at the end of the day, it's difficult for you to then separate the dragon from having won the team fight at the dragon and the subsequent gold that you gain from that. And I think that muddies the waters in terms of like what dragons provide in value. And then obviously you mentioned the timer, 4 minutes, right? So 4 minutes is where the game could be over feasibly in terms of feeling the game is over. And what I'll let Stu come in as well, because I'm sure he's got something to say. But like, does 4 minutes feel like a good time? Like, I feel like objectives should spawn early because it's a mobile game, and I really feel like you should accelerate the pace of the game. But how would we combat that? How would we suddenly turn around and say, okay, we don't want players to feel like the game's over if 4 minutes if they just do something wrong, because then they have to play the next 10 minutes. I mean, Stuart, what do you feel like? Obviously, you play a significant amount more solo queue ranked. You play more solo queue than I do, that's for certain. What do you feel about the 4 minute marker? Like, does that feel like?
The problem is that, I mean, like you said, I mean, it is a mobile game at the end of the day, and if you extend that time, or if you make that a little bit later, then the games might get later, the time frame might get later. I think I saw something saying about, like, what if, like, Wild Rift games lasted a long amount of time, or like someone, I think it was on Reddit or something, someone was saying that Wild Rift games last, too short or something like that. I think that's more of, like you said, I think it's more of like the solo queue mindset, I guess, of people, where they feel like, 4 minutes, dragon. I feel like it's more actually to do with how many kills people get, or like the team fight itself, more than actually the dragon. Like, even if you lose the dragon but you win the team fight, you still feel like you have the momentum, you have like the mental edge. Or even if you take the dragon and you lose the fight, you feel like, okay, we've lost the fight, the game's over, sort of thing. I mean, I don't know. I feel like 4 minutes is a decent time. Maybe like a little bit longer would be good, because like most of the time at 4 minutes you don't really get your first item unless you go back to base at exactly 4 minutes, for example. I feel like if everyone had like one item at that point, or if everything was kind of, I guess, balanced in a way of having one item, then it would be kind of cool. But I mean, I feel like 4 minutes is a decent time, but as you said, I think it's more of like the mindset of people thinking like, okay, 4 minutes, dragon, if you don't take it, the game's over, sort of thing, basically.
Yeah, that's an interesting discussion, like, add on there, right? 4 minutes is the point, especially in like competitive. You start to see major rotations come out of lanes, right? The laning phase effectively ends at 4 minutes, and sometimes at high elo you'll see people reciprocate that kind of play. Is 4 minutes an Endstep? I'd love to just hear your thoughts on this 4 minute marker and some of the things that we've been talking about. But is 4 minutes enough for you to realize the power fantasy of being good in lane? Like, that power fantasy of outskilling your lane opponent and generating an advantage that you built, which I think is really important for the personal satisfaction of a player, right? In my opinion, anyway. Like, do you think that the timers are a detriment to that, and do you think there are things that can be done to alleviate that feeling of 4 minutes being a kind of a game ender if you don't get it right at that stage in the game?
I think so. My personal take on this is like, I do think 4 minutes is quite early given the power level of the objectives that we're spawning, right? It's like, I think we could spawn a objective, right? Like, let's suppose, and this is just like some random, not necessarily saying this is good or that we would want to do this, but like just as sort of a sample solution to this is like, let's suppose the first dragon spawns actually at 3 minutes, but it's the buff, the power of the buff is like 1/2 or 1/3 of the other dragon buffs or something like that, right? It's like, okay, so this is something that it's probably worth playing around for the people close to it. Maybe the mid laners might get involved, but like it's probably mostly a jungle thing, and maybe a duo lane thing. But certainly at like 1/2 to 1/3 of the power of the buff, you're not disrupting the laning phase of the Baron lane to come down to this like dragon, right, or something like that, right? It's like, conversely, it's like, maybe the dragons are supposed to maintain their same power level but spawn later, and then maybe rift. There's like I think a bunch of different ways we could approach the solution statement here. But it's like, I tend to agree, at least from a personal perspective, and I think my team generally agrees with the problem statement of here of like the power of the objectives comparatively to how early they spawn is probably a little off. In terms of, we've pushed these things pretty early, and they can, they are very powerful to the point of where, like, what you were talking about earlier, where it's like it can be hard to differentiate, how much of the power is from winning the team fight versus getting the objective, because people fight over these things. But obviously, we would see in pro play, if they weren't worth fighting over, people would just give them up more frequently, right? Whereas you do see people opting into fights a lot more frequently, and they are worth fighting over. And so, like, once you hit that sort of threshold of like, this is something that must be fought, or like must be traded for somewhere else on the map, it's kind of more along the lines of like, maybe 4 minutes is too early for something that's so powerful that you kind of have to opt into these bigger macro movements to counter these things. I think that is more along the lines of the problem statement I would have, not necessarily that the dragons are always too powerful, or that or that like teamfight wins are too powerful, but more so along the lines of like, hey, the power level here is maybe not appropriate for the game time, or not appropriate for the required investment.
Yeah,
I think the
go
on.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, that's fair, mate.
Yeah.
You've also frozen a bit, so I didn't know what happened to you, but it's all good. You're back.
Oh wait, my stream just gets disconnected. Oh wait, we're back. That was a bit weird.
Yeah, it looks like stream might be.
Is my stream crashed?
Let me refresh it. Mine crashed. Yeah, it says you're offline for me.
Your internet your internet looks like it's taking a bit of a hit.
Why is my internet taking a big dump?
I ask myself that every day.
Why is it? What?
Okay, so we took a quick break because our boy Stuart got hit by the Virgin Media Gods, which in the UK, by the way, is a very common occurrence. They're an internet provider that's quite well known. Maybe equivalent to Comcast. I don't know what Comcast's reputation is like in the US, but Virgin Media are quite well known for having poor internet service despite having relatively good speeds. But that's basically what happened. I'm not going to put Endstep on the spot and making comment on any US internet providers, because that's not fair given his position. But there we go. Let's talk a little bit about where we're at right then. So we were talking about that 4 minute timer, and I think you were kind of explaining that 4 minutes could feel okay, but maybe the gravity of the objectives should be a little lower. And I think that makes sense. I kind of want to roll this into a conversation about strategic win conditions, because one of the discussions that I've had quite frequently throughout esports with Wild Rift is how many win conditions are available, compared to PC League, right? How many viable win conditions are available? And in terms of the game design team, like, how do you assess how viable like certain types of win conditions are? Like, obviously there is the group up and objectives, team fight strength, where you just kind of roll over teams. Obviously with League PC, there's always been a very viable split push strategy, which I think is a little harder to achieve in Wild Rift, and I think maybe is a good thing given the relative strength of towers compared to PC League. But and also the fact that inhibitors never respawn. But let's like, how do you guys go about assessing win conditions? And do you think that the current setup of the game potentially restricts win conditions? And is there something that you think that you'd want to change in the future?
So how we go about assessing win conditions is like, it's a bit of an interesting question, because there's a lot of different ways depending on the context of like why we're asking the question. Like in the case of, hey, do we think there's enough different win conditions, or do we think that there's like a good different variety of ways that teams win the game? I'm actually not, like, off the top of my head, like I'm not exactly sure where we would start, because I don't feel like we've actually had a problem with like games are too like end in too similar of a way necessarily. But I will say that like split push is something that we have talked about as like, could we buff split push, because it's actually hard, right? The map is smaller, so there's like some contention around, hey, is the map too small to actually make split pushing a viable strategy? And that question is sort of up in the air in terms of like what we could actually do there. But it is something that in terms of like, would we want more potential win conditions or more potential viability, is like, the answer I think is yeah, we probably would want more, but not that we're looking at the game and saying like, every game ends because of X objective fight, because sure, a lot of the fights do end at like 4 minutes, or a lot of these fights do feel like pretty game deciding at 4 minutes, but it's like the way that these play out does tend to be pretty different, of like, which team started the dragon? Did someone actually start the dragon, or was this off of the back of a pick, or was this off the back of like a 2v2 starting in in the duo lane, or was it actually a fight over Herald or whatever? It's like there actually is a decent amount of variety there. So I think our feeling is not necessarily that there aren't enough strategic win conditions in the game. Not to say that we couldn't improve them, but I think our perspective is more along the lines of like a lot of these strategic win conditions that are different in the game kind of end up feeling pretty similar after the fact of like, hey, one team got the dragon and won the team fight. Feels pretty similar to one team got the Herald and won the team fight, versus, oh, one team just, snowballed really hard off of early lane advantages or whatever. All feel pretty similar, I think, in Wild Rift, which is something that we would like to, make some improvements to.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think I agree with you in the sense that split pushing could be difficult. I also think like the challenges of split pushing is, as we kind of briefly mentioned, that because inhibitors don't respawn, if you make it too strong, is that just suddenly going to be the de facto way to play the game because you just push down an inhibitor tower and that's it for that lane? Like that's kind of doomed. And actually, that does bring me on to an interesting discussion: inhibitor turrets in general. Obviously, it's an intentional decision to not have them respawn, because if you had them respawn, then you open up this realm of possibility where games could be extended far beyond the natural means in Wild Rift. What are your take? Do you think inhibitors are in a healthy place? Do you think like super minions are too strong? Do you think it's too easy to take an inhibitor tower? What are you? And I don't want to make those loaded questions, by the way. I'm not intentionally trying to put an opinion in your mouth when I say that, but like how does the game balance team feel about where inhibitor towers are now? And have you talked about that relative strength of those objectives?
So I think in terms of like the power of taking an inhib tower and like how it actually affects games ending, we're pretty happy with that. What we're not happy with is what we call trapped games, where the inhibitors being down, like, this happens, I think, a lot. I think the most frequent cause of this, though I would have to look more into the data, I think the most frequent cause of what we call a trapped game is 2 inhibitors down, where one team might even make some good comeback plays, but they don't actually feel like they can come back in the game because they feel like they have to constantly defend their base. PC has a natural solution to this, which is that the inhibitors respawn. So, suddenly you get yourself into a space where you win a team fight and you defend for like 1 more minute or something, your inhibs come back up, and that's your moment to come back. In Wild Rift, that like specific moment of like your inhibs respawning obviously never comes. And so even if you make a good comeback play, I think we're not super happy with the state of, losing 1 to 2 inhibs can feel like
game over, right?
Game over from the perspective of like, not necessarily that the game is actually over, but that you don't have appropriate windows to come back because you're just constantly under this like pressure for the rest of the game. That's, I think, the more thing we're not happy about, which isn't to say that we want to go in there and like suddenly say they respawn or that super minions are weaker or anything like that. But there are lots of other solutions that could solve this problem in terms of like, maybe there's an objective on the map that and this is just like kind of a silly nonsense solution. It's like obviously not something we would do. Is like, what if there's just an objective on the map that just kills all the currently living minions or something like that, right? That can only be taken by the losing team. It's like, that would be a comeback objective that would be like, if you win a fight and your base is under threat, it's like, you go claim this objective and it kills all the minions on the map, and this gives you a pretty significant window to fight back against the currently like coming in waves of supers, right? It gives you a minute or 2 of like sort of of a breath of fresh air of like, okay, these super minions are not currently hitting our base, right? And obviously that version is like kind of silly, right? But something more in those lines, or like it could be something like respawning inhibitors in some way. But again, we are pretty sensitive to the game time issue, and so we're kind of working under like, game design. A lot of game design is kind of working under like a lot of different constraints. And so I've heard some people compare it to, though I don't think the analogy is perfect, is like there's like a puzzle, and the puzzle is constantly moving and you're looking for the right piece for the right situation right now, right? And I think currently we've kind of identified there is a piece missing here in terms of, there's a decent number of games on live that end up feeling kind of trapped because of this whole situation playing out, because the inhibitors don't respawn. And we don't love that. But we don't have the perfect puzzle piece to fit in that solution right now to say like, this is exactly what we're going to do, and it's like, and it's some easy solution or anything like that. More so than that we don't, more so than that we're specifically opposed to respawning inhibitors or anything like that, because it's something that like we have talked about. Like, should the inhibitor respawn? It's like we've discussed it, but it's just kind of like, well, it's a trade-off, right? We're probably extending game time in return for reducing the trapped game state, and it's like that trade-off isn't like something that we're looking at as like clearly worth it right now.
And I'm glad that you mentioned trap game state, because I fully align with that thinking. I think there are situations in Wild Rift where if you do lose those kind of objectives, you are stuck in potentially up to 4 to 5 minutes, and you see it in pro games. We saw it. I don't know if you caught the 40-minute North American game where where inhibitors were down, and there was some good comeback plays from the tribe team, but they were constantly under duress of just these inhibitors being down, and like because super minions are super strong and they push the waves out. Maybe there is a method by which the losing team can secure something that makes their minions stronger temporarily, so they're able to personally fight back against the super minions and not have to worry about the wave state for a little bit. And I think that's the thing in Wild Rift, that wave state is so impactful in terms of how the games play out, and super minions have such a ridiculous impact on the wave state that it can feel trapping. And there are a few occasions where I've seen teams come back from 2 to 3 inhibitors, and it's usually because someone's got a Vayne or someone's got something that can just like straight up clean up and get a team by themselves, and then make such a huge swing that they're able to then close the game out from super minions being in their base to ending on the Nexus with those death timers. That's a very interesting discussion, and I think there's obviously plenty of solutions that could be thrown in the air. Whether the right one can fit, like you said, is difficult to say. But it does bring me on to another objective that I've had discussions about, and it's Baron. Obviously, early on, the team felt that Baron was too strong, in terms of the buff that it provided to minions and how difficult it was. Baron, this is my personal take. I think Baron feels like the game-ending objective that it should. So I feel like taking Baron, it is devastating. You can make it feel devastating, and the minions, if you have the minion waves in the right position, you can essentially clean house. And I kind of want to refer back to the discussion that you had about 4 minutes. Baron obviously spawns relatively early on. Is that Baron power level suitable for the time in the game that it spawns? And have you guys had thoughts about the where Baron sits right now in terms of how you feel about it internally?
So I could tell you this is actually something we've spent a decent amount of time discussing, like not like this week, but I think like 3 or 4 weeks ago, we spent a decent amount of time talking about Baron and its place in the meta. One of the things that sort of came up, and there were some disagreements here, like not everyone on my team is necessarily exactly aligned on exactly where we feel like Baron should be and like where it is right now. But I think one of the things that we're generally happy with is that Baron is a game-ending objective, right? It's like, I think we're pretty much all aligned to like, yes, it is good that Baron is very powerful and games end when one team gets Baron. One of the things we kind of disagree with is like how hard should Baron, like how difficult should it be to take Baron? Is like my personal opinion here is that I think it's weird that Baron in Wild Rift is very high damage, but it actually doesn't have that much health. Like you can actually take it quite quickly. It does a lot of damage though, which it sort of like puts these weird incentives around champion picks of like, hey, if you're Master Yi, you can actually, under some circumstances, actually just solo the Baron. If you have enough, lifesteal and damage to just kill it really quickly. And 2 and 3 man Barons are actually quite fast, right? Relative to, and this is partially just relative to PC, but also, even ignoring the PC aspect of things, it's just like, I feel like the damage is so high that, situations where you win a team fight but you don't have any, like most of your members are like low or even just chunked to like 60%, it can actually be more difficult to take Baron than I think it should be, where the appropriate reward for this team fight is winning this team fight is probably Baron, but if you lose too much health, that actually is off the table as an option a lot of the time, which is kind of odd. I also think it's kind of like, sneaking the Baron 2-man is quite fast right now because of how low the HP is, which feels a little wrong to me personally. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that my team agrees with this line of reasoning. I think generally speaking, the things that my team agrees on are like, Baron should be powerful, and we like that it's really powerful, and we like that it's a pretty accessible objective overall. But my personal taste is more along the lines of like, I would rather us make up the game time in other places and make Baron a little bit tankier, and maybe even make it do slightly less damage, because it does create these weird incentives where high DPS, low durability champions actually are like very weighted towards taking Baron in Wild Rift relative to what I think they should be good at. It's kind of a little bit weird to me that Yasuo is actually like a god tier objective champion in Wild Rift because of the way that Baron is shaped. Which is just not necessarily saying it's wrong. I just think it's like a bit weird way to distribute power in the game. And I think it's something that I think the game could be maybe a little bit better distributed power in terms of like who is good at doing the objectives and like what is a good composition to do objectives, if that makes sense.
No, and I actually really do agree with your assessment here. And I think specifically I want to hone in on that point of late game team fights should feel like you can claim something when you win them. And I think there are those situations where, and you correctly pointed out, and you see it in pro play a lot, you see it in high elo solo queue a lot. You win a team fight, you often win with 3 or 4 members left alive, but you're on 10%, 20% HP, but you can't take the Baron. And by the time that you've reset and attempted to take the Baron, the enemy team's back on the field and you're already fighting again. And so that window of taking Baron, because Baron is just so powerful and the risk of taking Baron is too high that you end up losing, half your team. It's difficult to kind of like, it doesn't feel rewarding to have that objective there. If you can't do anything with it, you're just looking at it, and then it doesn't feel super rewarding to have that objective on the plate if at that point in the game you can't even consider taking it. I always feel like the player, once you engage in these meaningful battles, the players should be able to take relatively simple decisions to make and get a rewarding outcome from it. And I've always felt like, be that a tower, be that inhibitor, be that a Baron, there shouldn't be that many blockers stopping you from doing something meaningful in the game following a step like a fight, like a big fight. And I do think that sometimes Baron is its own blocker in that sense, that actually it's just too much damage and too scary to take when your team is quite low on HP following a fight. But I fully agree with kind of like the thinking there, and I think you can still see those moments in League PC. There is still those moments where Master Yi's and Trindamirs can solo Barons, but it's less frequent and requires much higher gold acceleration for those particular carries to be able to do that at that stage in the game relative to the relative stages of the game in PC and Wild Rift, I'd say.
Yeah, and there is a mechanical difference that actually makes this much easier in Wild Rift, which is that PC has a debuff Baron applies to the target that he is auto-attacking, which makes that person do 50% less damage to Baron. We don't have that in Wild Rift, which is something that I have previously pitched as like maybe we should have this to make it more difficult to solo, duo, trio Baron. It obviously doesn't super meaningfully impact the like 4 or 5 man takes, but like on the 1 to 2 man takes, it's really impactful, right? And it's like something that I've pitched before, but obviously, generally speaking in Wild Rift, we do favor like the design of Wild Rift does favor the simpler mechanics, and of course, it's a lot harder to ask players to understand this like random debuff that there's very little minimal to no communication about. So there's some discussion or some contention about doing something like that because the mechanics are very hidden and not necessarily intuitive in any meaningful way. And so I think I'm not necessarily saying that I disagree with the decision for us not to have that, but it is something that I've pitched before as like this would be a good way to solve our problem of like it effectively makes the Baron tankier, and in return we could probably reduce the damage if we wanted to and keep the Baron at relatively similar levels of power while kind of rebalancing this stuff. But not saying we're doing that. It's just something that I have previously pitched as something that we could do. And I still, if the time, if I see another good opportunity, I probably will pitch again.
Yeah, no, I think. I also think the whole buff discussion in Wild Rift is a lot harder to give feasibility to because you don't have the UI real estate to kind of read Baron buffs and minor buffs icons that you see. So it's like PC, you can kind of hover your mouse over it sometimes and give it a little read if you're interested or whatever. You don't have that capability really in Wild Rift, and so it's a little harder to kind of make those things feel accessible for the player base, which I totally understand.
Exactly right.
Yeah, I totally understand. In terms of the other objective, then the other one that I don't think many people really frequently talk about is Elder. Elder is an interesting kind of objective because, again, people know it's powerful, but sometimes you don't really feel that kind of power directly in terms of like, that it makes you stronger in a team fight most of the time, but again, it's one of those things that's hard to feel the visceral nature of it. And also, by the time that Elder's even getting involved in the game, you've already seen Barons, on the cards. You've already seen these objectives that are supposed to be game enders, and that leaves Elder in this weird spot that. To really take advantage of it, you have to have had a game-long investment in dragons. Like your team has had to have had a game-long strategy investment in dragons, and especially in solo queue, that feels quite difficult to play around. And then when you get a single dragon elder or a no dragon elder, it doesn't feel like it's like you're taking it to deny rather than taking it to win a lot of the time in those situations. And I guess I'll open the floor to you on Elder. Like how do you guys feel about Elder right now and what it's providing?
I mean, there's good reasons why we're doing, Elemental Rift, right? Like, I think we're not super thrilled with the current system of Elemental Dragons or Elder necessarily. Like, I wasn't a part of the original decision making or design process for Elemental Rift or anything like that. But so I can't necessarily speak to like what exactly were they thinking there. Because like, I know part of the thing that they were talking about was like, look, the current system is like, there's a lot of things not desirable. I mean, speaking of hidden mechanics, right? It's like, many players, especially in the lower to more average MMRs, literally don't even know that Elder scales with the number of dragons you have, right? Like there's nothing that tells you that in the game. Maybe one of the buffs you can like hover a tooltip, but like who's going to do that in Wild Rift, right? So obviously there's some like really undesirable things going on with Elder. Like my personal opinion is I actually think that it pretty clearly should have had the laser beam from PC and from the beginning, right? It's like just this really appreciable, like, look, I can literally tell what the Elder is doing. It is shooting a laser beam at that person, and that person is dead now, right? Like that's the kind of thing, like, since I have joined the teams, like that's the kind of thing I've been like very aggressively trying to pitch and trying to reshape more of the game about like, let's move away from these hidden mechanics, like multiplying the buff by the number of dragons that you have, and let's put more stuff into things that people can see and understand, right? It's like that's like something that I'm very big on, and I think my team in general, right now does favor very heavily is like, let's do things that people can see and understand, and not something that they might have to open the wiki and like look up and be like, that number is 10%, therefore it's better than this other number that's 6% of a different stat or whatever, right? It's like I much prefer the let's just shoot, like, whatever it takes, let's give the players a giant laser, and if that's what it takes for people to understand the power of the buff, then let's just do that.
Do you know what? I've always said I miss the Elder laser in Wild Rift, because that in the PC is like, that's a game ender. Like you like to, a massive 20, like, but is it below 20% HP? I can't remember what it is specifically.
I believe it's 20%.
There's this threshold. Obviously, you just get them below the threshold, and the laser literally just kills them, and you're like, okay, that feels visceral. That's like, the enemy team is like, I don't want to engage this team right now because Elder will literally just fry me. I think the problem with it in Wild Rift is because Elder is final, and that's it. Like, once the Elder's taken, if you have laser beams for the rest of the game, then you're looking at a rough spot where that feels like a trapped game in a sense. Like, you've got one team sneaks Elder or smites Elder, and suddenly it's like, oh god, now we've got to deal with 20% death laser beam, and that's rough. But I completely agree with you. I think Elder feels relatively invisible even though we know numbers wise it's big and it can have huge impact. It feels a little invisible in terms of what it provides, and I think a lot of people just play around it because it's that big shiny icon again. It's like, oh, that's a special dragon, and we have to do something about it, and like that. I think. Again, I very much am aligned with your thinking, like especially with Wild Rift, where screen real estate is limited and the ability to interact with hidden mechanics requires further steps than most casual players would be willing to take. Even though you've got that beautiful UI map system on the wherever it is on the pre-match loading, whatever. Most players will never really truly understand the impact that Elder can have, and I think just having something visceral that you can feel is nice. Baron is a very visceral objective. You make purple minions get big and they hurt, and like, that's visceral. It's easy to understand. Players know it. Whereas with Elder, it's like, I've got some boosts behind the scenes that you can't really see or feel, but they're definitely good because some content creator told me so, or whatever. Like, it's one of those things that I think is a little more difficult for your average player to understand. And so I definitely understand and yeah, get your reasoning there. I guess like, we've talked a lot about like objectives and we've talked a lot about like inhibitors and game design and kind of like how you feel. What is the like from a game design perspective? What is your like? Let's say you had a mission statement. Like, what is the game design's mission statement for a player in Wild Rift? Like, what are you ultimately hoping a player to get out of an average game of Wild Rift? And when you design the game around it, how do you meet that mission statement? You know,
that's a high level. That's a high level look. So I would say like there's I think there's different takes I could take on this. Like from the perspective of like my position as like a systems and balance designer is like, how do I like, what do I want the player, what experience do I want the player to have is like, well, number one for me personally, and I think pretty much for everybody at Riot, honestly, not even just game designers, is like, we want the players to have fun, right? Yeah. It's like that's like the ultimate goal here is like, we want the players to have a good experience, right? And we want the players not just to have a, you know, I mean, one of the big things with MOBAs in general is just not just that you have a good experience, but that hopefully you have a good enough experience that is different enough from the last good experience that you have that you can pretty much play it as much as you want and not feel like the experience is too similar to the one that you had before, right? Like that's one of the big reasons why League and Wild Rift try to patch every 2 weeks, right? Is like, if we just keep changing the game, we can allow people to play as much as they want pretty much, and they'll you know not really get into many of the many too similar game states, and you know they can keep having fun if they want to, and if they don't want to, that's okay too. But it's more about like, hey, can we get as many people having as much fun as we can here? And from my perspective, like on systems and balance, to get back to that, is like kind of what I'm looking at is like a lot of both the game to game variance and also making sure that there's not too many like rough edges in terms of, oh, this champion actually feels unbeatable, or this champion feels unplayable, or this item is unusable type stuff, where it's like, it's okay if some champions are stronger than others, right? It's not our goal for every champion to be exactly the same in power level, but more so that like the differences in power or the differences in tactics or strategy from game to game feel more just like texture, like different textures to the different games, more so than like the rougher edges of, oh, that game was unwinnable, they had, you know, A, B, and C champion and we could never win type stuff. Is like, that's kind of what my team is working to prevent, is like the really, really rougher edges of the sort of like dark sides of the game of like what can happen when things go wrong. You know, speaking more to the even broader version of like product strategy, like I couldn't even honestly tell you like, is Wild Rift supposed to be, you know, is it supposed to be, you know, casual first, or is it supposed to be you know, competitive first? Is like, from my perspective, you know, I would say we could do both, right? It's like we can have a fun, you know, game for the majority of players and also have a very competitive experience for a lot of players as well, right? And I don't necessarily think we have to sacrifice one to get at the other. There are certain trade-offs that we might make between one or the other, but it's like, to me, I want to pursue, you know, everyone that we can having the best experience possible. And that might sound like really generic and like non-committal, but it's like, I think we can do that. And it's all of the work that I do personally is all about improving the game for everyone. And it's like, yeah, sometimes there might be a time when we have to sacrifice, you know, 5% of one player's experience for 15% of another. But the hope is that we're always like sort of gaining in the neutral sense here of like, it's not a zero sum game, right? We're hoping that we always make improvements, and that over time we just get a better and better game.
Yeah, I completely align with that. And I think, you know, I think from my perspective, I understand that when you're designing a game, you're also appealing to certain players, different play styles and different fantasies, and kind of like the game is designed to appeal to as many power fantasies as physically possible for as many players as physically possible, but whilst balancing them all at the same time, which makes it very difficult to really hit that true neutral standpoint for a game. But that's, you know, I think that's very fair. Look, I'm conscious that I'm heading towards baby putting to bed zone time, so the podcast is almost an hour, so I think that's a relatively good start at the point. But I'm going to go for a quick fire round. Okay, so quick fire round is I'm going to say something about Wild Rift. Like either is you know, I'll give you an example to start off with, or a slow one. Lee Sin W, mistake or not mistake, and you know, and I'll let you expand if you want to, of course. But it'll just be like these small things about the game that could be worth chatting about. So let's start you doing. Lee Sin W, able to go anywhere. Mistake or not mistake?
I think this was not a mistake. I think there may have been things that were not done optimally in the process. Like maybe the champion was not considered with like, wow, this champion can literally, just ignores ward hopping and can go anywhere. But I think it's very clear that like the UI really does not support ward hopping in Wild Rift, right? So it's a absolutely terrible experience comparatively to PC. So it's like, I think it's pretty clear, okay, ward hopping is out, right? Like that just does not seem like something that can possibly be supported. Okay, so from that perspective, okay, Lee Sin, so much of the gameplay of this champion that people expect from PC is tied to that ward hopping. So it's either if he can't have it, right? It's like either the champion is going to be fundamentally very different from what people would expect in PC, or he gets he gets even more agency in terms of like, oh, let's just give him a free targeted dash, right? It's like I think there the free targeted dash was the right choice for the designers. But where I think maybe they might have gone wrong, and this is not necessarily a ding against them because it's like I'm sure that they had limited time and resources to work with, is like I think that they may not have done enough had a good enough understanding of like what this would actually mean for the character long term. Like they did make the cooldown significantly higher, and they did give him a refund mechanic to sort of pay him off for sticking in combat, and I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think there may have needed to be some other mechanic or some other meaningful limiter for the champion in terms of like when is this champion supposed to lose, because PC already has this problem, right, where Lee Sin kind of has like basically unlimited agency, right? Like the problem, if the Lee Sin loses combat, it's pretty much the Lee Sin's fault most of the time, right? It's like it's not because it's not because they got into a bad situation that their champion's weakness exposed them in or something like that, right? It's like, well, actually, you're Lee Sin, you had all the agency was in your hands like pretty much the whole game, and like Wild Rift didn't really like it did, Wild Rift's changes to Lee Sin did make the problem like slightly worse, but it's not like this problem is not present in PC too, right? It's like the champion pretty much has all the options, like is holding all the cards in most engagements, right? And I think the reality here is that the issue was exacerbated, but it wasn't really like meaningfully that different. So seeing the version of Lee Sin that's in Wild Rift is not to me like a failure of the design of the new safeguard, but more so, yeah, the champion design is like kind of flawed initially, right? It's like the champion design is not intended to be able to ward hop, right? Like that's very clearly not a part of the original design for Lee Sin. This idea that you can trivially get behind people and kick them back into your team or kick them in the direction of your choosing is like very clearly not something that's been intended for the champion, from the beginning. But it has been balanced around, and PC has decided that that's worth it, and people think the champion is fun, and so that's something that's kind of existed in PC for a long time, and something that people wanted in Wild Rift, and we paid a cost for that, right? And that cost was pretty steep. And it's possible that we need some other kind of mechanic to make that cost less painful for Wild Rift. But I don't necessarily think that they made the wrong decision. More so that in a perfect world, I think that they probably would have introduced some other kind of meaningful limiter for the champion so that it doesn't, manifest itself as, wow, Lee Sin just does everything, because that's kind of already true in PC, right? But it's like even more true in Wild Rift, and it's more visceral because of how free his mobility is.
Yuumi, mistake or not mistake?
I think pretty clearly not mistake, right? Like, I think a good example of this is like, she's like in solo queue in Wild Rift looking quite weak. She's still quite popular. PC, she's gone to like 40% win rate before and still been like 12% pick rate, right? Like that's crazy. For a champion in PC, like people clearly like the champion and they want to play this champion and they attach to the, whether it's the gameplay or whether it's the fantasy. Yes, she can be frustrating. Yes, she can create some bad gameplay experiences. But as I kind of mentioned before, it's like it's a lot of trade-offs, and I think Yuumi is a pretty clear, like huge win for a percentage of the player base that really wants this type of champion. And yes, like there is a cost to pay for this, just like there is for every other champion, and it's like she's kind of higher on both ends here, right? She is a higher fantasy win and a higher like payout for these players. Like these players love Yuumi, right? Like Yuumi is a very high depth champion in both PC and Wild Rift. Already we've seen her depth is quite strong in Wild Rift, as it is. Like the people who are playing Yuumi are playing a lot of Yuumi, even though she is pretty weak, right? And so we're kind of looking at this as like, this is a huge win for those players, and it is coming at a cost to some of the other players in the game that really don't like playing with Yuumi or against Yuumi or with Yuumi in their games. But our hope is that if we do, if we do these trade-offs properly enough, we eventually end up in a place where everyone is happier, right? Even though specifically the Yuumi trade-off might not be ideal for every single player in the game, right? Like everything that we do, every single thing that we add to the game is a trade-off, and Yuumi is a much sharper one than others. But our belief is that long term we do this enough, the game is better off.
I see Stu has jumped back in. Stu, are you alive?
Hello, am I still a robot?
No, you're not.
You sound good.
Oh, thank God.
Well, do you know what, Stu? Let's get you back on for the final part of the show.
My download speed this whole time has been like, 500, 600. My upload speed went as low as 0.01.
Oh, lovely.
So,
you love to see it.
While
Stu's getting sorted, I'm so glad that you answered that without. I totally meant it as a meme question, but I'm very glad that you that you answered it legitimately. That was very nice of you. I appreciate that, Endstep. Solari Chargeblade, mistake or not mistake?
I think it was a cool experiment. I think it's pretty clear that it hasn't worked out. I think we should probably do something about Solari Chargeblade when we can. It's like, so I can tell you the original design intent for Chargeblade was, hey, look, these 80 castery champions like Lucian and like MF and Xayah in some cases, they like haste, they like attack speed. It can be hard in some cases, in some builds, for them to build those things. And theoretically, there's a lot of like AD items they would like, but often can't buy because they're kind of shoehorned into fuller crit builds if they want to get, some of the bigger multipliers like Infinity Edge, right? And so Chargeblade giving 50% crit, as a single item, is kind of like this sort of theory being, okay, if we give the right stats and we give 50% crit on this item, under certain circumstances, we can put these champions into a place where they can sort of have, some castery items, right? Maybe they build a Manamune or a Ghostblade or whatever, but they can still get the big crit multipliers like IE, right? And it does sort of do that, right? Like this does actually work for champions like Lucian and champions like Xayah, right? Like it actually does this, its intended purpose. It also, unfortunately, does a lot of other things where it's like, Yasuo getting 100% crit from one item, probably not the most desirable for his build path. It's also especially weird because it's not 100% uptime, 100% crit. So he's really supposed to buy another crit item, which feels really weird. And then it's also kind of causing these issues where it's like, hey, this stat line and these effects are actually really good for Riven and Rengar. And it's like, and like we don't really want to support these champions having this weird high damage variance, crit playstyle where Rengar jumps on you and, one time he jumps on you and gets 3 autos and he crits one time and you live, and the other time he crits all 3 times and you die. And it's like, that's not really a great gameplay experience or really the way that we want to put variance in Rengar's pattern or Riven's pattern for that matter. So I think it's pretty clear that it does some undesirable things, and we would like to, like, that's something we've discussed internally as like we would like to address it. It's more a question of like, when will we address this item to sort of either do something like a little bit different or more clearly be, targeted towards its original use case rather than, hey, it's more originally intended for these sort of hybrid caster crit builds, but then kind of ended up being better on, melee caster assassin fighter people. That's kind of an awkward state for the item. Is like we'd probably want to move it into a different space.
Makes a lot of sense. And I actually want to, instead of going into another random quickfire question, I did want to kind of, now that we've touched on items and new additions and Wild Rift exclusives, Hextech Mega Drive and Ixtali Seedjar. I think I've chatted with another Riot game designer about this.
Roguefool.
Yeah, Roguefool. Chatted with Roguefool about it. I didn't know if I was allowed to say his name or not. But I've chatted.
Yeah, he's the one who made those items.
Yeah. And I think I've had chatted about those items specifically, and we were discussing about, did they land? Did they land as items? Are they being used? Are they actually realizing their power fantasy? And I've had discussions about the item stats. Like what they're providing and. And I think my personal take on Seedjar is it's like, why would you ever build it? If you were looking for that start line, why would you ever build it over Zeke's? Because at the end of the day, Zeke's gives you a much more consistent ability that you can use in every team fight, and it's going to give you a very, very immediate impact. Whereas Ixtali Seedjar, I've said, the power fantasy is blast coning your team over a wall into a team fight that is like, surprise, mother effers, we're here, and we've used Excoundrel Seedjar to make this happen, right? That's the power fantasy. But getting that to work in solo queue is nigh on impossible. Like, the team can barely tell that you've got a seed. Setting up the seed, you then have to like somehow communicate that you want all of them to stand on it, and spam pinging is not always going to work or even be timely, and it's very difficult to like get your team to really play out the fantasy of Excoundrel Seedjar. And so therefore, like, I love the idea of it. The problem is I think it's limited by the capability of the actual plants in game. And I think, as an item, the stat line is not good enough to say I want this over Zeeks, because at some point you're never going to stack Zeeks and Excoundrel Seedjar, because you just don't need that amount of flat resistances. You need some health before that to really make your effective HP good enough on a tank. And obviously it's a tank item, and it has its things. I think Hextech Mega Drive is actually quite well designed, but the power fantasy to me of Hextech Mega Drive is you cycle your active ability twice in one team fight. That's the power fantasy of that item, in my opinion. Like, it's like you buy it if you think that you can somehow get double locket, or you can somehow get double redemption or double spooky ghosts off in a single team fight for a support player most of the time. And because of the limitations on it, you're not realizing that right now. What is the discussions internally around those items, and kind of like what thoughts do you have as a game design team about what you can potentially do with them, or what your thoughts on where you could take them, if you're allowed to? Obviously don't want to reveal too much, but like, your thoughts on those two items specifically.
So I'll split this into two, because I think they're actually in pretty different spots from our perspective, even though from the player perspective they might be kind of similar, like look like, oh, new Wild Rift exclusive items that don't seem to get used very much. From our perspective, they're actually quite different. Mega Drive is something that we've been waiting on a bug fix for. So currently on live, if you CC multiple targets with the same ability, you actually do not get multiple refunds. That is a bug, and it is something that you might think, well, hasn't that been a bug for a long time? And the answer is yes. We basically had some unfortunate circumstances come about. Turns out the bug was a lot harder to fix than we thought it would be. And when we originally tested the version of the item internally, that's how it worked. Or it did not have this bug, and it got introduced in a later part of the item rescripting. So basically, we got into this tough spot where we've been waiting for this bug fix for a long time, and I think it's kind of damaged the item, potentially, for a long time here, where we kind of didn't buff the item, even though it's honestly been kind of weak, because we were kind of sitting around waiting for this bug fix. So when this bug fix comes in, which hopefully will be in 3.1, though I can't promise anything, we will reevaluate the item and say, like, hey, look, if the fantasy isn't real, if people aren't able to chain back-to-back actives with the multiple crowd, CC refunds, we should probably either be giving this thing more stats, making it cost less, or potentially even buffing the refund, right? Like, those are all things we discuss, and we haven't really spent a ton of time discussing Mega Drive specifically, just because of, hey, look, we've been holding off because of this bug, and that has sort of caused us to be like, hands off, like, let's wait until that comes in. We did the one small buff for enchanters because it was like, well, with enchanters, the hard CC thing, multiple hard CC targets is obviously not going to be big for them. And so we buffed the enchanter use case a little bit to see what that would do, and didn't move it super significantly for a lot of the more enchantery use cases. But, it was good. But that's kind of our perspective on Mega Drive is like, yeah, this is really unfortunate. We probably should have been a little bit more diligent about how we manage the QAing on the item and all that stuff. But that's kind of an unrelated thing, as unfortunate circumstances in the sense that we wanted to get that bug fix into 3.0. It didn't make it, and that has sort of caused us to fall behind on the item. And hopefully we'll be able to do something in the future for that item if it doesn't end up being nice with that bug fixed. For Seedjar, though, it's a pretty different story. Seedjar, I think there are a lot of reasons why Roguefool originally went with this build path, but I think it's pretty clear that the build path has not really panned out to be something that is super desirable for the item, and it doesn't really fit the space that he imagined for it, of being the one of these potential early options for a roaming tank support item, or a roaming just jungle support item potentially, or jungle tanky supporty-ish item type of deal. It's like he kind of imagined this as being a roaming item with this movement speed on it and the ability to plant extra vision cones for sweeping out wards, or bring extra honey fruit to your lanes, which funny as that is, it's actually pretty powerful, right? Or like plant blast cones for sneaky ganks or whatever, right? It's like, that's kind of what he imagined the use cases of this item to be, but it's pretty clear the build path doesn't really fit that fantasy. So that's something that we've definitely discussed of like, not saying like, next patch we're like changing the build path to, 4 ruby crystals or anything like that. But it's like, it's definitely something we've discussed internally of like, does this build path actually suit this item? And also, are there other things we could do to sort of improve the appreciability or the usability of the item, right? Like something we've spent some time discussing also is like, is the 3-second timer for planting seeds actually too long? Like, is this too long to actually wait around for these seeds to grow? Like, because obviously the in combat uses of the item at 3 seconds, it's like almost impossible to use this thing in combat in any meaningful way. So that's something we've discussed of like, okay, do we want to lower that? Do we want to, disable it using it in combat completely and then buff the item in other ways? Like, there's like a lot of things to consider here and like a lot of different ways to take it. And this is something that I don't want to spend too much of my time focusing on as well, because it's Roguefool's item and technically it is owned by my team and he's not on my team anymore. He works on Champions now, but we are giving him a lot of leeway of like, look, what do you like? You're the original designer of the item. This is your item that you have here. What would you like us like? What direction would you like us to take? Because from our perspective, it's kind of an underperforming item. So we want to buff it, and we also want to sort of keep in line with the original design expectations here, and make sure that he, is happy with the end state of the item. And if that means that, one day we want to turn this thing into a keystone or whatever, or put it into a different system, he's definitely been pretty open to that. And I'm not saying that that's what we're doing, but it's like, it's something that we are potentially open to, and Roguefool himself is also open to doing if we find the right place, the right situation, the right time of like, this might be, something that's better served in another system. That's something that we're open to for sure.
I remember having a discussion with him, and hopefully, Stu, we can jump him in just the end, because I know he had some Virgin Media internet issues, which have been beautiful to have to work with. I remember talking to Roguefool about the item, and I felt like, I told him that didn't feel the stat line was relevant for the people who wanted to buy it, and I think that, as I said before, given the stat line, it's a direct toss-up between that and Zeke's, and they almost always take Zeke's because it's just significantly better for what it provides you. And I talk a lot about consistency of item. Like, no one is going to buy an item if you don't feel like you're going to get value out of the effect. There might be those single use case scenarios, 1 in 10 games where Seedjar gives you some insane play, but it's not worth it to buy it consistently as part of your build path every single game. And I was thinking about ways that you can make Seedjar but retain the feel of the item. I kind of like this idea of how maybe Seedjar played into the whole growing like Rod of Ages type growing, where you gained stats based on picking up seeds and using them, and like, it encouraged you to make use of that item every game, and you got a payoff for it. Or, I had this thought of like Blast Cone. Could you have an in-combat use where it acted like a Zig Satchel charge, and you just press the Seedjar button, and you were able to just immediately blast without having to plant the item, and there's tanks. It gave them an extra ability to like do something in a team fight that was disruptive or made the item. That would probably be borderline OP if I'm honest with you. But it's one of those discussions about like how can you retain the feel of the Seedjar item, but like make it feel more consistent. Because the thing that I remember chatting to Roguefool about was that I feel like the consistency was the most important thing about this item. You'll find that build paths are built because they are consistent, and you know that what you're going to get use out of them, you know what they do, you know what they provide for you. Very few people opt into these more risky build paths because no one wants to take that chance of wasting 2,000 on a golden item that has substandard stats, and you have no idea whether the effect's going to be of use or not, because that could literally lose you the game, and you're not going to take the risk on 2,000 gold of you losing the game for an item that you don't know what it's going to do, or you don't even know if you're going to get effect out of it. And I agree with you. I think the honey fruit part of it is underappreciated, because double honey fruits is great, especially if you're roaming support and your mid lane is getting boned. You just drop a honey fruit off, and you're like, here you go, mate, have some more honey fruit. But there's always that risk of it just becoming a gold farming item with the honey fruit rune, and you're just suddenly like Sweet Tooth honey fruit, just farming 120 gold every time you drop off a honey fruit in the lane. But it's an interesting item, and I said to Roguefool, I do love the creativity of the item, and I love the thought process behind it. It's just about making it feel like a viable choice for players who want a bit more consistency in their games. And the problem with it is if you're not going to change the effect, you have to overbuff the stats. And suddenly then, if you're just providing too much value for money in terms of stats, it becomes a kind of unfun item because people just buy it for the stats. And, that's a difficult place to be.
Yeah, I think we have a little bit of a different perspective on it. It's like, yes, I tend to agree. It's like most players would prefer the consistency from their items. But I think it's okay if there are some higher variance items in the system. It's more so that not necessarily that there can't be a space for a higher variance item where it's like, you spend 2,000 gold on this thing and you don't necessarily know what you're going to get every time, but just that, there probably should be a higher floor on this item. Like, the minimum you can expect out of it probably needs to be a bit higher. And the top end maybe needs to be signaled a little better, or maybe even needs to be a little more accessible. Because theoretically, if you plant a blast cone in the middle of a team fight and you like get the perfect setup where you blast cone 3 people away, 3 of the enemy team away, and you like put one of their people in your team and you get to like kill them for free or whatever. It's like the top end is very powerful, but it's also really inaccessible right now. So I think there's a lot of discussion to go on there as to like how frequently do you actually hit the top end of this high variance item, and like how low is the floor? Because right now it's like the top end's really inaccessible and the floor is basically 0, right? Like the floor is basically you get nothing. So I think there's some discussion to be had, or at least some potential changes to be made to sort of not necessarily completely resolve, because it's like I think if the item isn't high variance, it's like not that interesting. Kind of to your point of like
Sure.
to overbuff the stats, it's like that's not a very interesting item. I think it's more to the point of like the stats should probably be a little better to bring up that floor, not necessarily to compete, to be better than other items, but like maybe a little more competitive. And the top end top end use cases probably need to be a little bit more doable for the average player. Of like, hey, maybe there's something we need to do to make it easier to like bring honey fruit to your allies, or maybe there's something we need to do to make it easier to understand where you're supposed to use the vision, like the second vision cone. Like knowing where to plant that's actually not that straightforward, right? Because you get this huge cone of vision and you don't necessarily know exactly where that's supposed to go, right? Like I think there's a lot of things that we could do to improve the accessibility there, more so than just give it a million stats and call it a day. I think that's like you're kind of saying, I think that's not likely to get us where we want to go.
No, I agree. I think it's a very interesting discussion, because Seedjar itself is a really interesting item. But I agree with you. I think, and when I say consistency, I don't mean I wanted to do the same thing every game. I think it's just more consistency of expected outcomes. And I think that the like you mentioned, the floor of the expected outcomes right now is nothing. Could be 0. And the ceiling is potentially infinite in terms of what you could do with this item, the flexibility of it. I think what I'm going to do now is just basically, Stu, he's looking very sad and despondent, and I know he's a little bit tilted at his internet. But Stu, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and just say anything towards the end here. I think your camera looks good, so you shouldn't sound like a robot.
Am I robotic?
No, you sound okay. You sound okay.
I mean, I've tried to restart my PC about 20 times. I've restarted my internet about 20 times, and nothing still seems to be working. I mean, I don't know where you two are at. I unfortunately haven't caught up with everything. Well, I haven't been able to listen to anything. I don't know. Have you already spoke about the competitive side of things, like competitive?
We haven't touched too much on competitive. No.
I think the main thing, I mean, with me is like wanted to get like your opinion, Endstep, on kind of competitive, like in general, and kind of the I guess you could say the meta with competitive at the moment, which you probably know what it is yourself. But do you enjoy the way the competitive meta is at the moment, or is there anything that like you would change personally, or you would like to see differently, try and sort of change with competitive Wild Rift at the moment with like the meta?
Yeah, I'll say before I get super into this is like, yeah, there's definitely things I would personally like to change, to shake up and change. But I also, and my team is generally on board with this of like, Wild Rift esports is a relatively new thing, right? Like, if you look at the early days of pretty much any esport, the game changes really rapidly, even when there's no changes to the game. And, even today, right? Like you look at a game like StarCraft 1 that hasn't changed in years, and, the game, like people still discover like, small changes to the meta. And so like, especially in the early days of the game, we're kind of expecting, even if we do nothing, that people will optimize new strategies. People will discover counters to the things that currently are considered to be the best, and the meta will change, even if we do nothing. And it can be dangerous for us to sort of assume that what's currently being done is the end all be all of optimal optimal gameplay, because we can get ourselves into some dangerous situations where, like, let's suppose we say right now, oh, AD carries are clearly underpowered for pro play. We need to do something about this. But like what we're looking at in solo queue, in generally ranked queues, is like AD carries don't really seem to be underpowered, right? And so we could potentially get ourselves into a dangerous scenario where, if we do assume that coordinated play AD carries are weak, and we try to do something to buff organized play AD carries, we could potentially put ourselves at risk of doing some damage, or harming solo queue or ranked queues for little gain to competitive, because it might also be the case currently that it's not even necessarily the most optimal or 100% optimal to only play AP carries, right? It's like recently the games that I saw today from that you were casting, is like there was a Vayne versus Xayah, right? It's like that's been that, and then when looking at the NA games and the EU games from like last couple of weekends, that was a relative rarity, right? And so maybe next weekend it'll be 50% AD carries in the role. It's like we don't necessarily know what's optimal, and this isn't like to dunk on the pro players or anything, or like say that they're bad or anything like that. It's much more so that, look, the game is somewhat new for esports and for competitive play, and we don't believe that everything is fully optimized here, right? Like, go back and look at season 1, season 2, season 3 League of Legends, and no one's taking teleport. That summoner was unbelievably insane back then, right? But no one took it. Like there's lots of things that I'm sure are undiscovered and yet to be optimized. And using an example from Wild Rift, for example, or I said example twice, but you get the idea. There were people that came to me up in arms, and like I talked to some pro players and some coaches and stuff like this about the like 4v4 or the like ARAM level 1 mid strategies that were coming up before Horizon Cup last year. And we kind of decided to do nothing, right? Like I kind of went over the strategies. I like did a lot of research on them, and kind of like was like, I personally think we should not do anything about this. Like, I don't think that this will be super present. And then it wasn't really present at Horizon Cup at all, right? There were some, a couple of 2v2s, a couple of 3v3s over the first mid lane wave here and there. But for the most part, this wasn't like some huge strat, which is like kind of what I like the information I got from a lot of people talking to me before Horizon Cup. So our perspective is like, even if we would like to see different stuff in pro play, more so that we probably should be more hands off unless something seems truly dire. In terms of overall strategies. Now, in terms of individual champions, obviously, if something is like 100% for months, we should definitely do something about it. And like I try and keep track of this as much as I can, to try and keep track of like, hey, yes, X champion. Right now it would be probably something like the closest to like a Fiora or a Ziggs, depending on the region that you're looking at. Like this champion's really high presence, and maybe we should be looking into them to try and do some like coordinated, focused nerf or something like that. As assuming that they're not overbearing and solo queue at the same time. Individual champions, maybe individual items. Like I think right now the item in contention here is probably Cleaver. Especially with the like quirky Cleaver build that is really bizarre to me. But individual like units, I think that's something that we're interested in. Like, yes, we can round these out for pro players and like help alleviate some of the pain points they might be seeing in their pro games, but more in terms of like overarching strategy, we are not as inclined to make sweeping changes to the game because of things that we're seeing in pro play, because we've already seen like very significant shifts in how pro players macro around the game over the course of the last couple months, when we haven't really made any meaningful changes to the way that the game's macro should play, right? So we're not in a position where we feel super comfortable making that type of change when we don't think that the pros are like even close to like 80% optimized in that area, if that makes sense.
I think the main thing about that as well, I guess, is that you don't really want to, I guess, like change too much in a short amount of time, because then you've got things like 3.1, 3.2, which obviously we don't, obviously but we don't know like what the changes are going to be and everything. So like 3.1 could justly change the game, and then you've buffed something maybe this week or something that actually becomes completely broken, and then you have to nerf it again. So I mean I understand totally. I mean I just wanted to get like your opinion, because obviously the meta at the moment in like competitive is very is a bit weird, I guess you could say. say,
Yeah,
with
it's for
some of
sure
the
weird.
champions and things like that. But it's nice to see that you guys are still like thinking about competitive and talking about it amongst the team and everything as well. Because I think like you said, it's still early, but it's still really fun to watch and cast and everything, and it's looking pretty good. I don't know what you feel like about that, Excoundrel, like competitive.
Sorry, just taking my Buscapam because my tummy hurts. I think my personal opinion is, and this is just from my years of competitive PC experience, I don't think pros are anywhere near to cracking the way to play the game properly. I think there are like the variance in tactics that we see is just a testament to how flexible the game is for pros right now. Dakun Gaming won the Season 0 World Championships, even though it wasn't official, by playing funnel jacks. Yet when you tried to see people play funnel jacks in other regions, they flop, and they flop really hard. So I think there is a significant variance, because I actually don't think any pro team has really cracked the best way to play the game right now. Neither have they really think they cracked the best comps to run on a consistent basis. And I think the AP carry bot meta is a result of the pros responding to stronger AD mids, with things like Black Cleaver being super popular, and stronger assassin meta, which is generally AD mid driven. And I think they just think that they need to have this big AP carry threat in the bot lane, because I've always maintained that I don't think you need to balance damage profiles in certain comps. I don't think that you need an AP carry in a comp that is going up against 0 tanks, because no one's going to natively build armor, and therefore the gains, yes, of course, natural armor buildup is going to give you certain resistances, but if the comp makes sense for what you want to achieve, you don't need to shoehorn AP damage in there for no apparent reason, right? So I think whilst balanced damage profiles are good, I don't think they're necessary in every single situation, and so therefore I think pros are still working out the best way to play the game, and I think it's going to take quite. I mean, League. You look at how League PC was played in seasons 1 to 4 in a pro level, and like it was complete fiesta half the time. Like,
it's like embarrassing, right? You
Yeah.
look at those games. Like I sometimes go back and watch some of those games, just for this nostalgia, and it's so funny looking back at the way that people played, and like people completely ignored waves, right? Like wave control was not even a thing that people considered until like late season 3 or early season 4, right? And that's like a huge part of the game now.
And I think it's only now that we're like, was it season 14, season 13? It's only now that we're like 14 years into League of Legends and sort of 10, 12 years into pro play that I think the game's getting figured out. And I think there is the right staff and the right coaching and the right kind of analysts on even pro level players to understand the game quickly and kind of make the best level changes. It took a long time for PC League to get there, a very long time, and I don't think Wild Rift is anywhere near to that point yet. It's a different game, different pace, different tools available to you. So I think whilst pro play can be a indicator, I don't think it should be a director. Whereas I think in League PC there is much more direction from what pro play is doing, because they have a much stronger grip on how the game should be played. Whereas I think Wild Rift, I don't think pros are anywhere near to knowing that, having that kind of level of experience. So it should be a good, like I said, I think pro play should be a good indicator, especially when it comes to champion strength. I think they're quite good at picking up on the champions that are strong, but I don't think it should be an indicator for like game design and game play. I think that should be much more catered towards what the data is telling you from an internal perspective, realistically. That's my personal take anyway, just from my experience around pro players and pro play. Which I think is a relatively sensible take, if I'm honest with you.
Yeah, that's pretty aligned with what I was already saying, right? Like, we're not necessarily here to, like, obviously, if things are, if something is particularly bad, and especially if it lasts for a long time, it's like maybe we might look into it, especially if it's something that's happening in like solo queue as well. But the stuff like about AP bot lane carries, I tend to agree, is like, it's kind of weird to me that when I talk to pro players about like, hey, why do you play AP carries in the bot lane so frequently, and like why do you play casters, and it's like the response I get most of the time is, oh well, all the great soul lane picks are really strong AD champions, and so we want a magic damage in the bot lane or whatever, right? And it's like, well, there's like, I have two huge counterpoints to that, right? Like, number one of the highest presence soul laners is Diana in most of the regions right now. Is like, she's actually quite frequently played, and so she's this magic damage champion. There's other viable magic damage soul laners like TF, and so if you're telling me that that's that's the case, then okay, so why are we seeing these champions then? Okay, number one, and it's like, okay, if maybe they're really strong and that's an exception, okay, fine. But then the next counterexample is also like, okay, what about Varus, right? It's like, if you're telling me that Varus is truly OP, then why isn't he 100%? And if he's not that OP, that he's only just a high presence champion, he's like a medium to high presence champion, depending on region. It's like, okay, so he's like a medium presence champion, but he's a physical damage caster in the duo lane. And so if you're telling me that you need magic damage in the duo lane to account for the solo lanes, what's the deal with Varus and what's the deal with Diana and TF and like these other magic damage picks, right? And it's like, seeing those picks occasionally, I could believe that that's just kind of a specific team thing or a random thing that might be fit the comp or whatever. But these are like non-100% champions, so they're clearly not perceived to be the strongest champions in the meta. But they're high enough presence that these are fairly common picks, right? And like to me that's kind of incongruous with this idea that the reason why AP, like the bot mages, are being played or why AD carries aren't really present is because of the physical damage solo laners. Because if that were true, that just doesn't line up with the presence of things like Varus and Diana, right? It's kind of the way I look at it. And one of the things I'm really excited about, and this is probably getting on another topic that might be too lengthy to get into here, Excoundrel, but we've actually just hired this week. They started the new game analysts for Wild Rift. So we have 3 new game analysts, and I am really looking forward to working with them. And one of the things I'm going to be talking with them very early on here is, hey, can you get at the root of this issue, or like what causes pro players to lean so heavily into these bot mage picks? That's one of the things I'm most looking forward to working with on them. And that's the kind of question that, like, previously it's been very hard for us to get meaningful progress towards answers in that area. And it's like, that's exactly what the purpose of having those Wild Rift specialized game analysts around is for.
I mean, that sounds really cool. And I hope I get to talk to those guys on a relatively frequent basis, because it'd be cool to kind of chat with them and think, chat through my thoughts as well. But I think in general, pro players are quite driven by popular thought processes rather than, I think, on actual testing and trialing. And I don't think there's enough scrim data. I don't think there's enough backing behind pro level play right now to like get that level of like, I know this is good because we have tested it 1,000 times and it's worked that way, right? Rather than well, I'm told that this is good and I get the theory behind it, so I'm just going to do it. And I think that I think there's like that kind of disconnect. But we'll get there. We're going to get there. But we're so early. You mentioned it. We're so early on in Wild Rift competitive, and
it's super early.
And like, you need only look at the differential between the top level EU teams and the bottom level EU teams to show that there is a big disparity in kind of like pro level right now. So it's just very interesting to kind of like just monitor pro progress, and also just you like, what you'll generally find is that regional metas in LoL PC are slightly different, but the general methodology behind the gameplay is the same. There'll be regional meta differences in champion picks, but the way that they approach the game is relatively consistent across the board. Whereas in Wild Rift, there is just such regional variation in terms of how SEA thinks the best way to play the game is versus China, versus Korea, versus EU, versus NA.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, and how big differences are.
But that only shows you that there is still no good, solid 100% way to play the game yet. And that's good for the game in general. I like the healthy openness of it, but also shows you that actually pro teams' opinions should be taken with pinches of salt right now, because everything is so open and so viable at pro level play right now, and that's a good thing, I think, overall, until it gets cracked, and then the worries start to come in. But it's an interesting discussion nonetheless. I do, unfortunately, myself need to turn in and go and get the babies to sleep. I don't know if you. Stu, I'm happy to let you and Endstep continue on your side of things.
Yeah, I'm sure you spoke about many things while I was having my fun issues at this perfect moment of time, when sorting this out and everything. But no, it's all good. I'm all good.
You are an absolute superstar, Stu, for getting back online. I know it's frustrating, and Endstep, you've hung out with us a long time now. You've hung out with us a very long time, so I very much appreciate that.
No, thanks for having me. It's been awesome. I mean, I love talking about Wild Rift and talking to people about the game. It's, I mean, like I've said before in my stream, it's like, this is good for everybody, right? Like it's I get to talk to you, you get to talk to me, everybody gets to have a good time. And like, absolutely, just thanks for having me over here and giving me the time.
No, we I think as Stu will speak for everyone, we say we more than appreciate having you on, more so than anything else. It's very, very much appreciated. And having I'm sure Draggles is partly to thank for this, but just the openness of the Wild Rift dev team is really good, and the player facing comms. And I'm working in comms myself. I know there are guidelines out there about how to interact with players and what you can and can't say, but like the comms that you have with players is truly outstanding, and is honestly, I think, industry leading in terms of how you should interact with your players. So I really do appreciate kind of like how you guys are allowed to go out and interact on socials and on these kinds of things. You've done a really good job of that.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. Like, I didn't tend to spend as much time talking to players when I was on PC, but mostly that was just like the position I was in as a game analyst just wasn't really a great one for talking to players. Is like more now that I have more, like a little bit more ownership as a game designer, over systems and balance. I feel a lot more comfortable going out there and just being like, this is what we think. And of course, I'm also in a lot of the meetings where I can keep up with, this is where our current thoughts are about this system, and like this is the sort of the direction we would like to go. In an ideal world, if we had unlimited resources and we didn't have to worry about art or whatever, right? It's like that stuff is a lot harder to talk about when you're not in my position. But since I'm in that position, I'm really happy to talk about this stuff, and I'm really happy to be the sort of spokesperson for my team, since generally speaking, they are not quite as I don't know what the right word is, open or like social media invested.
Active, I guess.
Yeah, they're not quite as active, especially since Rogueful left the team, of course. And like Rogueful, like honestly, he has surely put way more effort and put way more time into communicating with players than I have. Like he has tons of smaller conversations with players, and like I think it's a shame he doesn't get better recognition for that, because he put in so much effort and so much time, but just didn't do things as publicly as I have. And so I try to thank him for his work, all the conversations I have with him all the time, because he is an incredible designer, and he is absolutely incredible at communicating with players on a more like person to person basis, whereas obviously the way I've done things is a little bit more broadly open, and opportunities like this to do this podcast are one of the ways that I've really been happy to sort of open things up a little more. But that doesn't mean that other methods or other more personal methods, one-on-one type stuff isn't valuable too, right? And so I do want to say, like, there are other designers at Riot and other people at Riot that do a lot of this communication, and I wouldn't be able to do what I did without them. So huge thanks to them, and appreciate the people you've got, because things can get pretty rough out there at times.
I do want to echo Rogueful's Reddit commentary and Reddit interactions are absolutely insane. That man put out some work on Reddit interactions. He said to me that he's not a big like other social media platform guy, but he put a lot of work into the Reddit, which is absolutely fantastic. Hey Stu, I'm done. I'm going to shut up. I've talked way too much. I like I said to Endstep at the start of this, I am the kind of person who's just like him. I love talking about Wild Rift. I love talking about some of the deeper analysis behind it, and I will literally chat rubbish for hours on end if people let me. So Stu,
unfortunately, we don't have hours on end.
I will let you have the closing words, my man. You deserve them.
Yeah, I mean, thank you again, Endstep. I mean, hopefully we can get more people. Hopefully I don't have internet issues this time as well. But no, I mean, this is the sort of thing. I mean, as you said, it helps us, it helps you as well, it helps the community. Kind of get a bit of insight into everything, and hopefully soon we'll get maybe some other them, maybe Draggles as well. Who knows? Maybe the man himself,
Draggles will do it. Draggles will 100% do it. I know he will. He's.
But no, it's
I love talking to him. I mean, he posted that Yuumi stat. I was talking with him about that 57% of Yuumi Qs hit a champion, and he just went and posted it somewhere on YouTube, and then started replying like Yuumi facts, and anyone that said any reply to that is so funny. He's great, and working with him has been really awesome on all the comm stuff.
I mean, yeah, everyone's pretty good, but yeah, I mean, like I said, hopefully we can get some more people, and hopefully I don't have issues, but yeah, thank you again, Endstep. It's been a blast.
Oh, and before I end, you can catch Endstep's stream in the links in the description. And also Stu in my YouTube channel, and I'm sure Stu will do the same on his YouTube video. Really appreciate Endstep. This has been a banger video. Long, an hour 40, bloody hell. Hour 40 of content that has gone into this one. Stu, I will send you the video file. Yeah, I appreciate that very much.